Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Wow, guys, seriously. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, better. Everyone awake. Good morning to those watching us online. Thank you for being here. Happy Easter. So today we're gonna have our lecture done by our friend Marco, who's gonna talk about Easter and family. But as we always do, Patrick is gonna do the initial reading and the prayer for us.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Happy Easter. So we will read a passage from Happy Life, written by Divaldo and brought by Joana de Angelis. Do not put all your hopes in entertainment, trips, parties, and play. If the opportunity arises to enjoy them, fine, take advantage of it, and you will find that these pleasures pass away like any other satisfaction and leave you anxious for new chances to enjoy them, and so on forever. Some people sacrifice their future, taking out loans and making payments with extraordinary interest rates to live disillusions which come back to haunt them when the debts must be paid. Look for simple, lasting pleasures, those that do not disturb the present or unsave your future. So let's now close our eyes, elevate our thoughts to our Master Jesus, to God. Thank the opportunity to be here another Sunday, and this Sunday in special, that's Easter for us. Ask the good spirits to involve Marco and all of us here today so we can learn together. Thank you, and so be it.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So nice to see everyone here in this Easter Sunday, which is obviously a very special day for all of us. And you know, the theme that was planned out for today was to primarily talk about family, but obviously because it happened to be an Easter Sunday, we decided to, you know, add a little bit of Easter too. Why not, right? So it can be, and probably something else that I'll come up and and I'll add in the middle of this, so don't be surprised. Um, so it's important, you know, to talk about Easter a little bit. It's also to give some background to what we're going to talk about in later slides about family ties, because there, believe it or not, there is a connection there. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. Okay, so a little bit of history. I think we all know this very well by now, but I think it's always a good idea, right, to discuss Easter or the passage or Pesach or the Passover, right, which happen around the same time, right, and with the different context behind all of this. So interesting because, you know, obviously we know the story that Jesus was actually, you know, what was happening to Jesus around that time. Jesus was Jewish, right? He was there celebrating every year, you know, the Passover with everyone else, just like the tradition used to rule at the time, right? And of course, it happened that when they see Jesus again, right after he was, you know, crucified and taken as dead, right, as the eyes of the people at that time could see, that again turned into that entire week of celebration, right, into our now Christian tradition that Jesus' death does not really exist, right? That was really the transformation that happened, right, in the two different traditions, right? But the reality is that what was happening at that time, it is really a tradition that originated about 1300 before Jesus, 1300 years before that. As you remember, the Jewish people were slaves, right, for 400 years in Egypt, right? And I'm pretty sure you guys also remember the idea that there was like this 10 plagues, right, that occurred in Egypt at that time. Some of them actually have been some evidence that some stuff happened, some of that. And the 10th plague at that time was that there was going to be the death of the newborn, right? The first son, right, of the family. Um, and they used to celebrate this at the full moon after the equinox, right? So that's why it happens around different times of the different days of the year every year, right? And the way they had to protect the families, like the Jewish families had to protect themselves, right, against the angel of death, which is the Yahweh, was to paint the houses, the door of the house with the blood of the animal, right, that they would sacrifice to paint the house, so that evil spirit or the angel of death would actually skip or jump over their house. So that's why the idea of the Passover or the Joe Pesach, which is basically jumping through, right? It doesn't really go into your house, right? So that was the whole story. That was a way to celebrate that freedom, right? That occurred over 1,000 years before that. And the traditions, right? For example, for Jewish culture, the food is very important, right? As you remember, um, they had no preparation, right, to make that journey from Egypt back to their homeland. So, their food, they using the bread that they had was quite unique, quite different. They didn't have any yeast or growing right through the bread. It was just like almost like a dough-like bread that they used to eat. So they still eat today. So it's very traditional, right? The celebration for them lasts for 4 weeks. It's a very interesting story, right? So obviously everybody celebrated the Passover, right, which was the protection against that 10th plague, right? Which, yes, there is some evidence now suggesting that there was some sort of yeast, I think, that they were able to pinpoint around that time that may have contaminated some of the food, and because the born child had the first speak on the food to eat, it may have been that they were actually sick, right, because of that yeast contamination in some food items. That's what the more like the scientific evidence behind all of this, which obviously we can't really prove or disprove, right? These are all theories about what happened, but that is not the important thing, of course, right? So it also brings some interesting things about protection from evil spirits and kind of, that concept, right? That is related to the Passover, right? At that time. There are rituals that date way before actually the Exodus, right? From Egypt. For example, we have different cultures, the evil eye, the amulets, right? The crossed fingers, from spanning from Turkish to Greek culture, from all different traditions. They have some sort of ways to protect against this sort of evil entity, right, that would harm them, right? So this is all not new, right? Gargoyles, right, jack-o'-lanterns, and all sorts of things. So we still do the same, basically, right, in different ways, right? We're all somehow creating these interesting artifacts to protect us against some sort of evil, right? So this is all ritual, and if you guys think that we're all special because we're spiritists and we don't have any rituals, that's actually not true. We still have a lot of that inside of us, right? And we still do a lot of things, even though we may not know exactly why we're doing it, we still do it, right? And I'm pretty sure some of us will have some sort of pendant or rocks or something somewhere, right, in our walls that means some sort of protection, right? That's the same concept, right? It's still inside of us. Not surprising, we're all incarnated at that time, right? And not surprising, we're probably the ones throwing the stones at Jesus at that time, right? So none of that is surprising, right? We're kind of still on that kind of the baby steps, right, of that particular type of evolution. Okay. So obviously, for us now, thinking about Jesus, right? It's quite interesting that the celebration of Easter, as we know, right? Easter as the new life, right? The new existence, right? Slightly different from the Passover, right? It is also we may think it happened since the very year one after Jesus was seen, right, as taken as dead. But reality, it happened over 200 years after that, right? So the early Christians were not really celebrating this, right? They were studying it very much like what we're doing here. And as you also probably remember, that it was prohibited to show as Christians at that time, right? So they were all hidden in catacombs and hidden meeting sites, right? To read the scripts and talk about Jesus. But they were not like celebrate, oh, this is Easter, let's celebrate Easter. Like it did not happen. Like in all the imagery related to Easter also did not exist to many years after that, right? And you can take it anywhere from the bunny to the egg to this and that, right? Those are all things, traditions that arise from different cultures actually that were taken over, right, by Christianity after a few hundred years after Jesus. Okay. So for example, this is like a trivia, right? But the Easter eggs, they have over 60,000 years of history, probably way before all of this, right? And it makes sense, right? Because if you wanna, it's springtime, so it happens right a weekend after the full moon after the solstice, right? So it is a time where upper northern hemisphere is starting culture, right? As we know here, we're here, like in this exact same parallel, right? That they used to be. So because of that, this new cycle of life that's starting with spring, they would celebrate things that would have imagery of fertility, right? And the bunny is always a symbol of fertility, right? So that's kind of where it all started, right? The idea of an egg is an interesting concept too, right? Because it represents life embedded as a seed, right? So it's like just like a seed of a tree, the egg will be kind of the seed of life for animals, right? That kind of thing, right? So it brings life, right? So this is way before any of the other stories that we're talking about, right? So the eggs come from much earlier traditions for polytheists, right? They really believe in a single God at the time, right? Completely different, right? And they used to make it colorful and give them as gifts, like we normally do today. Like chocolate didn't even exist at that time, right? And I have to say now another. See, I told you I'm going to add stuff to the lecture, so I'm starting now. Chocolate is an interesting thing. Like, who came up with the idea of going in the jungle, finding this fruit? Have you seen the fruit? It's very strange, right? It's not, it doesn't feel like, oh, I'm gonna eat this, looks amazing. No, right? Taking that, not eating the fruit, because the fruit is actually like this white, very juicy stuff, right? Getting rid of all of that, right? And then you get the seed, right? And then you roast it. And it's super bitter, impossible to eat. And then someone say, okay, I'm gonna roast it, I'm gonna grind it, I'm gonna mix with sugar and milk, and I'm going to make chocolate. I have to say, this is a puzzle of science for me, because I cannot understand how was that ever thought, right? Just like coffee, right? There's a spirit that came with that mission.
Yeah.
The mission's like, I'm going to go in this beautiful, I'm going to find this tiny little fruit like this big, which looks super cool and nice, and it's like if you ever tasted coffee, the real coffee, not the bean, like. No, but I'm not going to eat any of this. I'm going to take this, I'm going to roast it, I'm going to grind it, I'm going to put it in water, and I'm going to drink it. Really? Like, I still like, thank you. Thank you for that spirit, blessed spirit that came with that incredible mission. That, keep us all here, like with our confidence in our hands, right? Go figure that out. I still have trouble understanding that. Okay. Okay, let's go back to the thank you. You can put comments at the end about the speaker today. Okay, so what about spiritualism, right? Let's go to what we're studying today, right? So one of the first most important things that we have to think about when we're looking at the spiritist view on all of this is that respect, right? And I think you find it in many places that that by knowing a different perspective on these things, we end up kind of dismissing the history of other traditions, right? And saying, oh, this is like, nah, I don't know why people are doing this, as some sort of superiority, right, to this. And this makes no sense, right? Although we do understand maybe some of the spiritual perspective of what the resurrection means, that does not, we should not, we ought not celebrate certain imagery and rituals of other people. That does not make us any better, right? Or different, right? We're just having different perspective things. So we have to really respect, right? Particularly traditions that are far older than what we believe, right? For example, in the Passover, which is a beautiful tradition they still keep alive today. Now, so if we can isolate a few topics, right, from the entire week, let's say, of Passover, Easter, right? There are a lot of things that are very important, right? The idea, the idea of freedom, right, which is an important one. So you can think about the idea of freedom, the concept of being slaves and being freed, right, which was the original Exodus, right, from Egypt. But also, if you move from that material perspective of freedom to what Jesus brought, you see there's a very subtle transition, because for Jesus, freedom was to show that death did not exist. It's a different freedom. So it's a freedom from those ties, right? From the old man, from the old perspectives, right? That you can be free in a way that inside of you, you can have a new you, like reborn, right? In that tradition. So completely different concepts of freedom. So we can also think about, the idea of inner transformation, right? So how many, seeing what happened, right, immediately changed, right? And you can see the apostles, right? So the apostles, for example, is a great examples, right? Because we're looking at the apostles. So this is spirits that at that time were already prepared to take on this mission, right? And we always like to think like, oh, Peter denied Christ 3 times. We denied Christ like 5 billion times, right? And we're like, oh, Peter did it 3. I'm like, good, Peter. You're like just 5 billion ahead of me, right? And we don't understand how tough that mission was, right? I always like to think about this. So, let's say you're just a, remember, let's say we go back to that time, you had tiny little boats, right? Handmade, right? And you go fishing every day. That's your routine, right? And you have your family, and you go fishing, catch your fish, you feed your family, maybe trade your fish, and like things go, and you keep your life going, right? You have your own bread, right? That's your life, right? You live by the Dead Sea, right? So someone randomly comes walking down the beach, right? Random stranger, right? Say, listen, stand up, follow me, leave everything behind, your family, your boat, whatever. Just go. You'll be fine. This is your real you. And he stands up and go. Like, would you go? Come on. If someone says, yeah, sure, I'll go right away, it's like, please just talk to me, because I need to understand that. Because I would not. I'll say, get out of here. Like, you're bothering my fishing, I shoot, So this is what the apostles did, right? So they leave everything, they leave everything behind. Why did that happen? Because they were really prepared spirits. This is spirits that have incredibly elevation, like moral, like prepared. They go to school for that. So they come and incarnate with the missions, like, this is my mission. When time comes, I'm going to jump on it, right? And they did. So we come with missions too, right? We come with missions. We get prepared. We come here. We got all ready. And then mission comes, like, oh, man. That is so much work. I can't do this, right? I'm just going to take it easy, right? By free will, right? I can do it. So 2,000 years ago, these spirits are just like rocking it, right? And we're just bad mouthing, everyone because oh, they deny Christ 2 times, or oh, they betrayed Jesus, right? Come on, right? Come on, let's think about that, right? So it talks about that. But then if you think about all the apostles, right? All of them, right at that moment, right? When Jesus crucified, they're all going to this thing, they're all scattered, right? They're all like, oh, this is too much, right? I'm next. Makes sense, self-protection, right? We would have done the same, right? Although Mary's did not, right? By the way, women, thank you, right? Because you saved the day one more time, right? Because the boys all like, oh, I don't know this guy. This guy over here, like pretend that I'm cooking, right? And the guy just talking about who's the followers of Jesus. Like, I don't know. It's like I'm just doing something. And the women were all there with him, right? Around him. Anyways, see, adding another topic to our lecture. Because I'm going to talk about family. That's why that's the hook. Right? We're going to get there. But then all of a sudden, like when Jesus came physically and showed him, right, to them, right? Which, by the way, the women again that believed him, right? Otherwise, the guys are like, oh, prove me. I need to put my finger in your wounds, right? So male, right, to do that, right? The women were like, oh, Jesus, thank you. The guys were like, oh, come on, this dude, right? I gotta do, anyways, on the topic. But they were there, and when Jesus, goes there and say, okay, this is me, like I'm alive, right? There's a moment where you can see in history that they will all transform, achieving their full potential. That's the moment where all of them will actually click and say, okay, now I get it. This is my mission. And now they all take on those roles and they die for it. You see this big transition, right? So the Easter moment, right, represents that Jesus coming back and saying, guys, what you're seeing as life is not real life. The life is this life. So he shows to us what he was saying all along, right? That you see, there's many houses in my Father's world. My world is not from this world. Take your coins, that's yours. I don't care about. He's been saying this all along, right? And people are not clicking. Right? They're like, oh, yeah, what's he talking about? So a lot of people probably saying that he was going nuts, right? It makes sense, right? When that happens, when he comes back, right? And it's like, okay, here I am, right? That's when really you see all of them say, okay, I got it. This is it now. There's no doubt about it. Let's move on. And they take on their roles. They go to different places. They start preaching. This is where the movement starts. So that transformation is also what Easter represents, right? Is that rebirth, right? Of who you really are, the getting rid of the old you, right, to this new you, right, by the example of Jesus. Not the example of Jesus that we're so stuck on, like which is Jesus' body on a cross, right? That is actually not the imagery that Jesus wanted us to look at, right? That is all physical, right? It is suffering, right, in our eyes, right? But he was so aware of his mission that he said many times, like, they have no idea what you're doing, right? And we lose that important message that stays behind is that, okay, when that imagery is not, there, what it actually means Easter, right? Which means that this transformation, right? New life, right? It also, again, like I said, it shows again to us in a very real way that spiritual life is the real life, right? And the physical life that we live on is our temporary life, right? It gives that clear perspective, right? Because Jesus says that, right? Very clear, right? What else right? That we learn from that time. So when the disciples then, start to take on their roles and move around with little wrapped up pieces of what they could write right under their shoulders, and they kind of go around and start to spread the word. This is not an easy time, right? You can imagine that if it was difficult for people to actually realize that Jesus was Jesus and follow Jesus, can you imagine like another random guy that now is just a fisherman, like walking around and say, okay, this is the word of the Lord or Jesus, right? It was even harder, right? But they persevere, right? And obviously they've received the blessings, right? As a spirit, they receive blessings that allow them to, for example, speak different languages, right? And communicate with other people and increase the ability of understanding and speech, words, right? They're able to communicate much better. And that was part of the plan too, because they were ready for it, right? It's not a miracle, actually who they are, right? This is really who they are. But if they haven't really so the next topic is perseverance, right? That we're seeing about Easter. Because if you think about it, if they say, you know what, this is like, okay, this is too much. I can't just go to Greece and start talking to these guys, that philosophers, right? I can't go to, I can't go to Europe, right? And hide in the catacomb and talk about loving one another because they're going to be killed, right? But they persevere, right? And that is what allowed us to be here today, right? Because if it wasn't for that, none of this here, this message would have actually reached the stage where we're discussing right now. So the early Christians are really the drivers of that. And that's why when you look at manual books, for example, when you talk about 2,000 years ago and all that, when you're talking about the stories of those spirits that are given their selves entirely, right, to the message of love one another, it is incredibly deep, tense, and powerful, right? And I think this should resonate in us, like particularly during this time of year, right? Because that is really the message, right? That that God wants, right, from us to remember. Okay. So there's Emmanuel writes, and I'm going to read a small passage here from the book Pathway to Truth and Life by Emmanuel, right? He writes a chapter called Knowing and Doing, which I think is really, really important today, right? John writes this. John writes, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. Right? These are the early communications of Christians. And Paul Tarsus too. Paul has beautiful letters, right? The Thessalonians, right? Saying the same thing, right? Like telling them, it's like, this is your new church. This is your new, way of thinking. Like, go for it, work on it, right? Seed, like send this message, right? So Emmanuel says there's a big difference between knowing and doing. Everybody knows, but just a few do. Right? Yeah, sounds like right. Like I'll classify into that category too. Okay, so in general terms, all religions teach goodness in general, right? All of them have assistants, believers, and disseminators. However, their apostles are becoming more and more rare. So we're talking about, just told the story about them, right? That they took on their mission without hesitation and say, okay, this is what I need to do, right? And they did it. There are always voices indicating the pathway. They transmit to us the words of those who know. Very rare are those who courageously go forward in the daily struggle. Many times they're left in silence, abandoned, and misunderstood. This is the supreme trial of those who do. Jesus understood the vacillation of the children of earth and transmitted to them the words of truth and life, producing a maximum example through arduous sacrifices. The existence of an elevated theory creates the necessity of experience and work. If an edifying action was unnecessary, then the most humble theory of goodness would be fruitless, right? So what he's trying to say is that, you can say as many beautiful things as you can possibly, you can read all books from Kardec and from, everything, all the 450 books that Chico Xavier wrote, you can read all of them. If you don't do it, what does that mean? Fruitless, right? You can't really transform. The example of that transformation that Easter brings, right, with the disciples and everyone around Jesus is really powerful. So that's what he was saying here. John observed the Master's teaching with wisdom, telling us in the verse that only those who practice Jesus' teachings can be really, really the blessed ones, right, as we understand, right? Here in the Christian service resides the difference between culture and practice, the knowing and the doing, right? Emmanuel. So I think if you summarize, then this is a completely different angle, right, on Easter, right? Because, I don't want to go into this technical aspects of how do they see and touch Jesus. That's actually quite straightforward. We can read the Venus book. They can show he can show his spiritual body in any way he can, because he has complete capacity of changing his spirit. He's so elevated, right? He has absolutely full control of what they do, shows, projects, make you think, image, touch, anything. Like all our senses become, like baby senses, right? Compared to the ability of Jesus to show his body to us. So yeah, that is not, I know everybody's stuck on that, but that's actually the easiest part of Easter, right? Easy to explain, right? The hardest part is this one, right? What does that all mean, right? And then if you take that with the Emmanuel's words on it, I think it summarizes pretty well, like the concept that, yes, that was very important, but then the next step is like, what do we do with it, right? Are we going to still see it as something super magical that we celebrate on a Sunday, eat some chocolate eggs and move on? Or are we going to take the road of the disciples that on that day clicked and realized, well, yeah, I got it. I got to do something, right? And they did it. That's what Emmanuel is saying. Knowing and doing. We have the free will, right? We can make that decision, right? We can make that step, right, in the right direction. But it takes, as I said, arduous sacrifices. And not only because you sometimes are going to be seen as different and strange and odd and all that, but also with ourselves. Because we have to face ourselves to do that. We have to look inside, which is the hardest thing to do all the time, right? And say, well, if I want to do this, first of all, who am I, right? And understanding who you are, what should you do and what you can do, and then you move in that direction. That inner transformation is tough, right? It requires a lot of work, as the knowing versus doing tells us here by Emmanuel, right? But this is really one of the critical times in the year to think about that we can get that example and run with it, right? We should, right? And it's so interesting because when I was preparing for this lecture, 5 minutes before I came on, when I was thinking about the lecture, right? I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about, again, me, right? And this could not be more timely, right? I was, looking at myself and saying, why being so, stressed out about things and, explosive with things that are tiny, right? Why am I having this behavior sometimes, right? And it was so hard to look inside of me and say, well, this is still you, right? This is you, this is me, right? It's not that I'm stressed and, it's the work's fault, it's this fault, whatever's fault. No, this is me, Marco, right? I'm struggling with that, right? And I'm trying to figure out other things that should be the cause of it, which, we always do, right? It's a self-protection mechanism. It's like you blame the other kind of thing, right? But I was looking at myself for this lecture and what I was doing and the moments that I lost my temper and explosions and all that. And I was looking at it, I was like, wow, this. And then I look at the first slide that I opened on that day was this slide was this part talking about, the rebirth of the new you inside of you, right? And I'm like, it came as this massive rock in my head, like bam, I hit right there, right? And I was like, yep, I got it, thank you, right? Because really that's what I needed, right? See, that's what I needed. I needed to really go through this preparation to do the entire process and allow this old me to continue to go away, because it's a process, right? And allowing this new me to continue to regrow, rebirth, right, inside of me. And it is not easy, as you can imagine, but it is a process that we have to do it every day. It's like taking a medicine, right? Jesus is the doctor of the soul, right? So it is really a process that we have to do every day. Okay. So that's what I kind of wanted to talk about regarding Easter, right? I also wanted to talk a little bit about family, because that was the originally planned topic of the day, right? And I mentioned two things about families, which I'm gonna make the link. See, yeah, that worked. So remember when the apostles were they were told, right, to say leave everything behind, like including families. That's a shock to us, right? It's like how can you do that, right? The answer comes in a question, right? And this is in a chapter in Gospel according to Spiritism in the New Testament, right? So who are my brothers and who are my sisters, right? Remember when Jesus was in the house, right, with the apostles, right? And obviously, can you imagine? Now, I have to make that imagery in your minds now. Imagine that you have this tiny little house in the middle of nowhere, right? Like, in like a fisherman village kind of thing, right? And you're there, this tiny place, and then Jesus in your, like I said, Jesus is a family member, right? He's in the house, right? Sitting. And then literally the entire population of the entire region comes to your place, right? Because Jesus is there to listen to what he says, to get close to him, to feel, he's a preacher, right? He's actually talking. And you're there now taking care of like 5,000 people, right? Making room, finding chairs, doing this, and the house is a disaster. So his mother, could not get into the house, right? Makes sense, right? Can you imagine? And then his brothers, like no one could get into it. Like the house was like packed full. There's people like hanging from the trees. Remember, there's actually descriptions of that, right? People trying to grab his clothes. Like this is like imagine that scenery. So this is happening inside our houses now. I imagine that, right? So the apostles come and say, well, your mother and your brothers are outside, and they kind of, they wanna chat with you, like say, Jesus, what's going on? It's like you're destroying our house. True, right? Like from the physical eyes perspective, right? So that is the question then. It's like, who are my brothers and my sisters? Who? Right? Isn't that an interesting question, right? Because from our physical eyes perspective and family ties, right? Talking about family ties, if you see only the physical part of things, right? If you see only the physical relationships, right? And you forget about the spiritual families, right? It makes it very difficult for us to understand who our families for real, right? Because, realistically, our spiritual families are much larger and much more complex than our physical families are. So much so that we all have friends outside our families, that we have a much better relationship with most of our family members, right? Makes sense, because that's our spiritual family, right? Members of our spiritual family. And we have sometimes people in our family that also have a very long spiritual relationship, and we love them and get along really well. And we also have spirits in our family that are the opposite, right? We have a very hard time and we're brought together because we have to, and we have to figure it out, right? So Jesus obviously touches upon that in that context, right? And I'm going to read exactly what he says here, right? And that's the preamble is the same, right? They're sitting, right? The people are seated in the house around him, right? And someone says to him, "Your mother and brothers are outside calling you." And then he says, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Right? And looking at those who were seated around him, he said, these are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does God's will is my brother, my sister, and my mother." Right? And this is Matthew writes about this, and and in different parts of the gospel, right? So Paul writes about it too. Paul says, if anyone does not provide of his own kin, especially of his own family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever, right? So Paul writes a lot about family ties too, right? Very important, related to relatives, right? And then in the Living Spring, Emmanuel is going to write this, which I think I find very important, right? Of course, the familial team in this world is not always a bed of roses, right? Quite often, it is a thorn bush of worries and anxieties requiring sacrifice. However, although we need to have a firm attitude in order to temper our affections, right? We can never cleanse the wounds of our home with the whip of violence and plaster of negligence, right? And you continue. Relatives are works of love that the merciful Father has given us to accomplish. Let us help them with the cooperation of caring and attending the design of true fraternity. Only by employing patience, understanding, tolerance, and goodness, right, on the narrow shores of the home, we'll be able to serve on the sea of broad experiences, right? So Jesus gives us a message very important at that time, right? Because for those spirits that left their families, right, to follow Jesus, it was all part of the plan. There's nothing wrong with that. Jesus would not create something that would be detrimental or negative, right, to someone. It was all part of the entire planning for that particular event to occur in this planet. Like how much planning needed for that to happen, I don't even know. I can't understand. I can't even fathom that idea, right? But what I do know is there were several meetings from higher spirits, including Jesus, right? Even before planet Earth was created, to discuss how was this entire process be planned out. In other words, how the entire process of evolution of our planet and us as spirits would occur in this little piece of rock floating, in the universe. How crazy is that, right? So we're here talking about fishermen and all that, and all of a sudden we jump to this planning of the evolution of the world. So you can find that in the book Evolution of Two Worlds, right? Jonas. Very interesting. Anyway, we talked about it. Okay. So, in summary, as we put it this way, right? And if you look at the Spirit's book, chapter 4, right? There's a very nice and easy description, right, of family ties in the spiritual world, right? That spirits they form groups or families, right, in the spiritual world that are united by sympathy, by affection, and by the same spiritual inclinations. In other words, not by you think you do or you say you do, is by what is in your thoughts and your heart. That's how we get together in the spiritual world, right? So if it's in my heart that things are not good, so who's going to hang out with me? People that are, maybe not thinking the same way, suffering, right, in a hard time, right? In the opposite spectrum of it, if I was able to move on from a lot of my negative inclinations and thoughts and ideas, I'm going to congregate with spirits with the same concepts, right? Doesn't it make sense, right? So if you're someone that really likes classical music, like you're a classical, like all, like you can summarize the entire Beethoven's, work in 5 minutes, right? Would you go to a concert that is exactly the opposite of that and be happy? Like, yeah, that's what I want, like punk rock show. Very unlikely, right? Because it's not the same vibe. Like, it's not saying that one is better than the other. No, it's just that, people have different tastes and different ideas, right? Now, when you're talking about emotions and thoughts, is a lot more complicated than just listening to music, right? It's really the core of who you are, right? And that you can't change. Because maybe you go to a concert of punk rock and you really like it. It's like, oh yeah, actually I didn't know that. So now I like Beethoven and punk rock, and you have more friends, right? But yourself, who you are, you can't do that, right? You're only one person, right? One spirit. So we have to change, right? And the real affection survives, obviously, the body. And not only that, it's strengthened by the process of reincarnation, okay? Because if you really, really, really love someone, the true meaning of it and the deepest meaning of it, it doesn't matter how you reincarnate, you're still going to have that same feeling over and over and over and over, right? So that is very interesting. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, right here, chapter 14, he talks about corporeal kinship and spiritual kinship. So in other words, relationship in the corporeal spiritual world. And again, this is the concept of family ties. And again, I would highly, recommend you guys giving a quick read on it. So this is to explain some of the events happening also during the Easter, right? That we talked about. You know how they left their families. You know they lived walking around as Jesus for kilometers and kilometers with this. Thousands of people following them, and they have to provide for them. Like everything changed, right? Those relationships, right? And even Jesus himself giving a lecture about spiritual families using his own family at that time, right? As an example, which I find very, very adequate and interesting for us to discuss, right? And before I run out of time, I'm just going to finish with a small passage, right? About our responsibility now in families, now related to our responsibility with our kids and the continuation of our families, right? So, Gospel according to Spiritism, chapter 14. Oh, Spiritists, you must understand the great part that humanity has to play. You must understand that when a body is created, right, the soul which incarnates in it has come from the spiritual world in order to progress. So understand your duty and then put all your love into bringing the soul closer to God. The care and education given by you to a child will help its improvement and future well-being, right? That is really, as a family, our main responsibility, right? To make sure that within our families, right, we're doing everything we can to fix our issues, any problems, troubles that we've had with anyone. Like this is the time to work it out, right? And that's why we're in a family, right? So we don't really have we have a lot of together time, right? It's like when your kids give you trouble, it's like give a timeout, it's like move them away, right? It's like it just you're not really fixing anything, right? You're just like pushing someone away from what's happening. Maybe giving a break, but at the same time, realistically, you have to be time in, right? You have to be with the person, right, to fix the problem, right? Not out, right? Like timeout is not a good concept, right? And that's why Jesus does that. Like the spirituality does that with us in families. Like there's like, okay, so you two can't stand each other. Like you've been killing and fighting and doing all sorts of weird stuff for 500 incarnations. You guys are gonna come brothers and sisters. You're gonna come together from the womb. So you're gonna be twins. You look the same. You came the same valley at the same time, right? And you're gonna have you're in the same room, and you're gonna wear the same clothes. Oh my, like this is like I can't stand it, right? But this is the concept, right? It's like you guys having trouble. Time in for both of you, not time out. Time in. I'm gonna put you both together. You're gonna look the same. Can't say. You're gonna be so bored. You're gonna go to the same school, same classroom. You're gonna have the same friends. I'm like. Yes, can't fight, right? That's kind of the spirituality kind of teaching us a lesson, right? It's like this is what you're doing. Time is. Okay. All right. Thank you, guys. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Marco. Do we have any questions or comments? No, a lot to think about it. Just make sure you do it well so you don't come stuck with a twin. That's the lesson. That's the close for today, right?
There's always a
Yeah,
message.
I will
yeah.
remember about the timing for you later
I
on.
need it.
Yeah, I'll make sure that every time I'll give you timing. So thank you for those who joined us online. We're gonna get ready to the passes. So have a lovely Sunday. See you guys next week.